Welcome back. We're going to wrap up chapter 2, and we're going to talk for a few minutes, not a long time, but a few minutes about applications of the production possibility model or production possibilities curve, depending on how you want to refer to it. And it starts off by talking about market systems of most modern economies are based on exchange. If you think about, let's say you go to your local Best Buy and you walk in, how many of those goods and services in Best Buy were actually produced here in the United States, and how many were actually imported from another country? I mean, because now we're talking about international trade, and the market economies based on exchange are always going to be pushing international trade, because it goes back to Adam Smith, and when he talks about specialization of labor, it goes back to comparative advantage, and countries, are going to produce on that production possibilities curve where they have the comparative advantage. And so, and it'd be the same thing if you walked into a store in France, and I can't think of any of their department stores, but you walk into one of their department stores and you're looking at, Levi jeans. How many of those Levi jeans were produced in France? And more than likely, they were produced somewhere else and imported in. So international trade is huge in this global economy. And it's, when we're talking about comparative advantage, and we go back to Adam Smith, we're talking about, he refers to it as absolute advantage. Producing on that production possibilities curve, that is your absolute advantage. And then they introduce another economist, and he's an English guy, functioning in the 1800s, David Ricardo. And he talked about each person should specialize in the good in which they have a comparative advantage and trade for the other good. In the text, I think they talk about pizza and beer, I think. Can't remember the examples that they used in the text, but I think it was something about pizza and beer. But it's the same thing, if you're talking about computer chips in Taiwan, agricultural products in the United States, comparative advantage, and companies or countries focus on that comparative advantage and then trade for everything else they need. And they talked about in the text about comparative advantage. Maybe you're a physician at Meharry, and you're a physician at Meharry. You're better off specializing in those attributes that enable you to generate more utility for yourself, rather than being a physician for a couple hours a day and then having to cook your own meals and grow your own food and build your own house. Specialize in what you have a comparative advantage at. And then also, Ricardo talked about exploiting comparative advantage allows the economy to maximize production. The process, and then he talks about the process of exchange is what distributes that excess production. United States, we may have an excess of this fall of corn, or an excess of soybeans, and we may be exporting corn and soybeans to other countries around the world, maybe exporting to Africa or wherever. And we're importing at the same time. We're importing computers from somewhere. We may be importing washing machines. Maybe you're importing, Mercedes-Benz, BMWs, whatever, because those countries are, importing again French wines or French champagne, because those companies are functioning at their comparative advantage on that production possibilities curve. And as Ricardo talked about, through the exchange process, they are exporting the excess production to other countries in exchange for goods and services produced in those companies that they have a comparative advantage for. And it says exchange and trade continues to redistribute jobs, and many require training. When you're talking about specialization in any given country, you're going to have a redistribution of jobs. You're going to have some people unemployed because an economy, a production process, a factory stops producing certain goods and services. because, they don't have that comparative advantage anymore. And then you've got some unemployment. But unemployed jobs not necessarily means, gross unemployment, as it means an opportunity to learn a new skill, to redistribute or reposition those jobs. There's a huge, concern across the United States and actually around the world. What's AI going to do to the availability of productivity of jobs in any given country? So may not mean that jobs are eliminated. It just may mean a redistribution or reallocation of those jobs. And then that, we're also talking in the text about greater production of goods and services through specialization, gives people more goods and services to enjoy. And exchange of goods improves the standard of living for all countries. Think how mundane it would be living in a country and the only goods and services that you could consume and enjoy were just what was generated or what was produced in the country in which you're living in. From my perspective, it's not the type of world I'd want to live in. And as long as there is free trade and free exchange, individuals in most global economies are going to be better off, have a higher level of satisfaction, and maximize that value of their utility. And then they talk about, economic growth, GDP. If you were taking a macro class, it's, one of the factors that you would, focus on in that class, because unemployment, inflation, economic growth, GDP, they're more of a macro type study, but they still talk about it here because in relation to the production possibilities curve. And it talks about an increase in the production ability of an economy it's represented by an outward shift of that production possibilities curve. What can a country do to shift that production possibilities curve outward? Because remember, earlier in this chapter, we talked about if you have that comparative advantage, you're producing on the curve. If you are either inefficiently allocating your resources or have an inefficient production process, you're functioning with, between the origin and that outward bowed production possibilities curve. So you're functioning inside it. And we said at that time, because factors of production were fixed, points outside that production possibilities curve are unattainable. Now we're talking about economic growth, and we're talking about making changes, either increasing the level of factors of production. So something has happened that there's either increased labor, increased capital stock, increased natural resources, increased technology, increased entrepreneurship. So they're no longer fixed. And so either increasing the factors of production or you're increasing the knowledge and know-how because something that an entrepreneur has done to improve the technology driving that production process that is generating the ability to improve the process of taking inputs, factors of production, generating it through the process, and ended up generating output through that we can either consume within the economy, or you can use an exchange and barter and trade. But all of that is increasing GDP. One of the things that they do reference, and again, it was something I talked about either in chapter 1 or 2, when you're talking about an economy's decisions, what to produce, how to produce it, who to produce it for, there's always that fourth one out there that corporations, economies, countries have to be concerned about, is somehow you need to reserve some of those resources so that you will be able to produce and grow the economy in the future. And I think I think the example they use in the book, as far as, growing the future, that probably applies to some on this class, is you can plan for your future as a student rather than living for today. And the example I think they used in the book is, do you work and pay for your college tuition, or do you work and buy clothes and booze and fireworks and enjoy yourself today? So there's that fine line of everybody making choices where, again, it goes back to scarcity and choice and opportunity cost. You as a college student want to maximize the advantage that you're gained through having a college education. You want to maximize your grades. You want to maximize your knowledge, maximize your understanding, because that, in theory, is going to give you a greater stream of income, a greater stream of revenue in the future, or it may propel you into a graduate program somewhere, and you may want to go down the roads of a PhD. You may want to go to medical school. You may want to go to law school. You may want to pursue some other professional avenue to help maximize your future revenue, rather than going to the fraternity party tonight, going out, down to Tootsie's down on downtown Nashville, going out to dinner with your friends. It goes back to choice, and they're talking about, economic growth, talking about saving resources, talking about focus on today for future productivity rather than just living for the future. And then we're going to spend just a few minutes, and I touched on it earlier in this class, or talking about this chapter. We're talking about economic systems. And they talk about a command socialist economy. There is a mixed economy. And then up here on the other end of distribution, you've got this market capitalist economy. And as I mentioned earlier, the market capitalist economy, it's, based on free enterprise, based on free exchange, resources and decisions in the decision-making process of the what, how, whom, and what do you save resources for, that is typically controlled by private individuals, private corporations. And if you look at the command socialist economy, the government primarily is the owner of the resources. They make the decisions. They allocate the goods. The government is dictating. If you think about, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, governments are dictating how who owns the resource, how they're to be used, and how they're going to allocate those goods and services. Up here in the market capitalist economy, and again, UK, United States, New Zealand, Singapore, private individuals, either private individuals or private corporations, are owning the resources, they're owning the production processes, they are making the decisions on how those goods and services are allocated. And a lot of that is driven by maximizing utility, by maximizing profits. So again, optimizing, remember, go back to the three things that differentiates economics from other social sciences: opportunity cost, optimization, self-interest, and making decisions at the margin. So we're talking about the optimization and self-interest in a market economy. And then you've got this mixed economy, and it's somewhere in between. And I mentioned earlier, it's, Sweden, France, Germany, kind of three that come to mind for me. And that's because they are constrained somewhat by, government-based laws, regulations. They're not as freely moving as the United States and, in the UK, but, more so freely moving than Cuba and North Korea. And then you've got, in the 80s and 90s, and I mentioned earlier, Korean Wall came down, I think, in the 80s, and kind of the desire for personal freedom to allocate resources by comparative advantage to, conducive to entrepreneurship, while those are their big drivers in a market capitalistic economy, you're seeing shifts in the world in the 80s and 90s, and more countries wanting to move toward that direction. And you saw the places like Russia and China kind of start to move away from this command socialist economy somewhat, and start to move into that mixed economy arena. They're not nearly far along in the continuum as, Sweden, France, Germany, but they are gradually starting to move in that direction. And then the last kind of tie things together, even in a market economy where there are thousands of buyers and sellers, most market economies, even those that are market capitalistic economies, still depend on the government for some things. They depend on the government for security, for military, for education to some extent. There are certain services that there's not enough profit margin, or there's not the technology available for private industry to generate those goods and services. So through taxation, they typically, in most of these economies, depend on the government for some level of services. And of course, anytime, and I'm sure all countries are the same way when you're talking about government intervention. Uncle Sam here in the United States thinks they know better than anybody else how you should lead your life. So governments, especially in the U.S., they encourage some consumption. They have subsidies for solar panels. There's some subsidies out there for electric vehicles. Again, they subsidize consumers' choices or consumers' decisions in such a way as to get them to move in a certain direction that the government wants you to. They also discourage consumption to some degree, and at least growing up in the Southeast, through taxes. So taxes on alcohol. Growing up and especially in I think it was downtown Nashville, there was something called a poll tax, and that was a tax for gentlemen's clubs, for lack of a better term, for strip clubs, and in the 70s and 80s. I don't know whether the tax still exists or not, but still, it was a tax to discourage those types of choices that you could make as a consuming individual. And then there are some government laws and regulations that try to stop things completely. Drug use, especially heroin, cocaine. They've legalized marijuana in a lot of states, but there are some government interventions because they are using it in the I guess the vein of helping individuals be healthy and reduce healthcare costs and help individuals live longer. If you watch the news, you're always picking up bits and pieces. And it seemed like I was watching Fox News the other day, and I guess they referred to him as Biden's beer czar. But somebody, I don't know what's in the CDC, but some physician has decided that I think current parameters in the CDC were, if you were a male, you could have, 2 drinks a day, 14 drinks a week, and still be okay health-wise. If you're female, maybe it was 1 and 7 drinks a week or something. I don't remember the exact parameters, but this new, quote, beer czar has decided that he likes to follow the Canadian approach, and that going forward, males in the United States can only have 2 cans of beer a week, which again, it's the government's attempt to control your consumption habits, because the government thinks they know better than you how to live your life. So there's always going to be government. I mean, the bottom line is always going to be government intervention, no matter what market economy you live in, no matter which country you live in. There's certain things that the government does better than private economies. Security, military, I can't say healthcare because they don't, but still, they're just certain services depending on your country that the government does better than, private industry can do. And a lot of it is driven because private industry is not enough profit margin in it. So there's not the optimization, there's not that self-interest portion of it to drive optimization and especially to drive utility and profit maximization. That's going to wind us up on chapter 2. And the next time you hear from me in this class, we're going to be, jumping into supply and demand. And we're going to be using the things we picked up in chapter 1 and things we picked up concepts in chapter 2. And we're going to start tying them together on supply and demand. And as we move into supply and demand, it's a chapter that students, at least that I've had in the past, sometimes struggle with. There's a lot of moving parts in supply and demand. So I look forward. I've always enjoyed teaching micro and macroeconomics, but the section on supply and demand, sometimes gives students some trouble, but we'll work together and get through it. And it's going to be not hardly as bad as some people think it will be. So that's going to wind it up for me for right now. And again, thanks for joining, and I'll talk to you soon when we jump into chapter 3. Thank you.